Let's move now to the second speaker, who is Professor Zimbert van den Brick. Είναι συστηματικός θεολόγος και
A systematic theologian and currently holds the chair of the theology and science at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. He previously was a minister of the Protestant Church in the Netherlands. He has authored many publications on evolution theory and others. The topic of his paper is Food and Faith in the Anthropocene, a Theological Exploration.
Yeah, Gisbert, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be invited here, especially since I'm from as you mentioned, from the Protestant tradition. So it testifies to the ecumenical spirit of the organizers to have me as a Protestant voice in your midst. And I think we deeply need an ecumenical spirit, especially when we look into the challenges of the Anthropocene era. We need each other to reflect upon these and to combat these actually together rather than each on its own in his or her own church. So in the previous years, I've been involved with issues in science and religion, especially focusing on the biological theory of evolution and how that relates to the Christian faith. I found myself challenged by issues which were brought up by evolutionary biologists with regard to the Christian faith. And I wrote some stuff, including a book on Reformed theology. I'm from the Reformed tradition, so the tradition that goes back to John Calvin in Geneva, Reformed theology and evolutionary theory. But then at some point in time, I realized, even though these discussions still interest me a lot about evolution and theology, that they were not as urgent as some people think they are. Where we come from, perhaps, is not as important as where we are heading. So at that point, I decided to change the focus of my research from not looking backwards to how the human species evolved and emerged, but looking forwards to what time we are going into. And that made me turn towards eco-theological topics. So at the moment, I'm preparing a book which we probably called A Brief Theology of the Anthropocene, A Brief Theology of the Anthropocene, in which I will try to let the relevant doctrines of Christianity interact with the disturbing conditions of the Anthropocene. So how should Christian theology interact with these conditions? How should it perhaps also be critically addressed from the perspective of the current ecological predicament? To what extent is Christian theology complicit to the ecological crisis? But also, conversely, how can theology shed light on the contemporary ecological crisis and perhaps mitigate its effects? Our conference on food in the Anthropocene, and I very much like this theme, by the way, because it's so concrete. So it prevents us from, as we theologians like to speak in the abstract, it prevents us from abstracting from the concreteness of this theme. So this provides an excellent opportunity for me to add a part on food to my manuscript. In a sense, speaking of the Anthropocene, as Chris already pointed out, there's a debate among scientists when it all started. I will not go into that debate. The debate makes it difficult to find out what exactly is special or specific of the Anthropocene when it comes to food consumption and production. But in any case, I think there are three important differences in the current era. As starting from, let's say, indeed, the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution. So first, unbeknown to most people, a massive extinction in our food sources is taking place. I have a quote from a British, am I speaking too fast still, or is it going well? A bit slower. So there's a British food journalist. You can be a food journalist. Some people are food journalists, right? Dan Saladino. And he wrote a massive volume called Eating to Extinction. And he says, I quote, "We are losing diversity in all the crops that feed the world. Yet diversity was the rule for millennia. Few varieties have survived until the 21st century. Instead, all over the world, wheat fields have been cloaked in a blanket of uniformity. And the same is happening to all our food at faster and faster pace. So there is this tendency towards monoculture, which is going on across the world. A second difference, as is most iconically expressed by the contemporary industrial livestock farming, today's agricultural methods profoundly impact the current ecological crisis. And many aspects of these crises become more and more intertwined and reinforce each other. That has never been the case before on such a massive scale. And third, most people, especially in highly urbanized parts of the world, have become entirely alienated from processes of food production. So we just don't know what's going on in this. Someone pointed that out already. We just don't know what's going on in all these factories where our meat is being produced. And that results in a kind of indifference. There's a large indifference among the common audience to these developments, which are quite disconcerting after all. So irrespective of the issue where exactly the Anthropocene started, the current situation is much more disturbing than past eras or epochs in human history. In all sorts, we have been destructive to the land since human civilization started. And everywhere, in every society where people started to do agriculture, the results were deforestation and depletion of the soil, and also decrease of biodiversity. That has been the case all the time. But these three developments are still specific for the Anthropocene era, I would say. Now, this brings me to a second series of reflections on the theological significance of food. There's ample reason for theological reflection and analysis about food, I would say. What can be said about the theological meaning of food, and what are responsible patterns of behavior with regard to food? So first, this very general question. I like the generality of this question. Why do we and why do all living creatures need food at all? Why did God create the world in such a way that no species whatsoever can do without feeding on other organisms? We all need to feed on other organisms. And from the perspective of creation theology, it must be observed that this belongs to the goodness of creation, I would say. So Genesis 1, of course, says that creation was good, was very good, and apparently the fact that we have to eat is part and parcel of the goodness of creation. But how can that be a sign of goodness if it comes with so much death and in many cases even suffering that we eat and sometimes are being eaten? It's by no means easy to answer such questions, and the Western theological tradition has sometimes resorted to the fall of Adam in paradise as a kind of explanation for that. So after Adam's fall, the divine punishments came over the human race, and one aspect of this was that we had to become omnivores or carnivores, and also even animals started to devour each other. The idea is only after the fall, so this was not part and parcel of God's good creation. But now that we know about evolutionary theory, such speculations have become, to my mind, unconvincing. And in the eastern part of the church, they were never as popular as in the western part where I am from. So patterns of eaten and being eaten must have been around from the very beginning of life on Earth. But why so? Why did God create a world in which every living being must somehow eat? In his instructive book on food and faith, Norman Witzby, I'm very sorry that I couldn't make it yesterday evening. I was very interested about, among other lectures, also his presentation, because I think he is the authority today when it comes to Christian theology and food. So in his book, Food and Faith, he has elaborated a layered answer to this question. Witzby, first of all, points to the profound interconnectedness of all forms of life. We all live by feeding on other creatures until we are fed by other creatures ourselves. When we die, we are going to the grave. We will be the source of food for microorganisms or insects or whatsoever. So there is some fairness, it seems, some equity involved in that. And there is no escape from this pattern. So we are interconnected with all these other forms of life at a very deep, profound level. And having to eat reminds us on a daily basis on this fact, on the fact that we are not the autonomous, independent, self-sufficient beings which we often wish and pretend to be. Instead, along with other species that God created, we are deeply dependent, needy creatures. So arguably, even in the eschatological life, we will still depend on food, right? Just as Christ did, according to the Easter stories after the resurrection, still depend on food. So this is the first reason. The interconnectedness of all forms of life is highlighted by the need for food. Second, food comes to us as a gift, Witzbar points out. Even if we have worked for it, as we say, we are still dependent on what the world around us provides us. On successful harvesting, we are dependent on all those who are involved in the production and distribution of food, etc. All this comes to us as a gift with the Creator as the primary giver. So an attitude of thankfulness and reverence is fitting, not just towards God, but also to the many life forms and natural processes through which God keeps us alive. Now, perhaps these theological readings may still be very traditional, but Witzbar adds a third layer to them by highlighting the notion of sacrifice in this connection. And he considers the creaturely processes of eating and being eaten as a mirror of the Trinitarian divine life, characterized as it is by the self-offering of the Father and the obedience of the Son, and the Spirit bringing the two of them, holding the two of them together. So from this perspective, we may accept our own death as a way of gratefully and lovingly sacrificing ourselves for the benefit of other forms of life. This is what Witzbar points out as well. And I think he even wouldn't be a principled vegetarian because of this idea that, like we have to feed on organisms, we are also ourselves being fed at some day by animals or by other organisms. And there's something good in that. That's at least the strand of thought which he puts forward. Now, thirdly, that's my final big issue. How do I do it? Yeah. In which way can Christian theology prompt meaningful ways of relating to food, given the many predicaments of the Anthropocene? Now, I bring together the first part of the lecture about the Anthropocene with the second part, which was on food in general, theological significance of food in general, and now I bring the two together. And here I take my starting point in Christology, and more particularly in the doctrine, what is called the doctrine of the threefold office of Christ. Now, I'm not sure whether all of you are familiar with that one, because it has been elaborated in most detail in the Reformed tradition, which is my own tradition, but it goes back to the Fathers, and it has also been adopted in Orthodox theology. Even though the various offices of Christ are usually not distinguished as clearly and in as elaborate a way as in Western theology. So according to Eusebius of Caesarea, Christ is, I quote, the only high priest of the universe, the only king of all creation, and the only chief prophet of the Father. So Eusebius distinguishes between these three offices of Christ as priest, king, and prophet. And he adds to that, interestingly, that this Christ has filled the entire cosmos with Christians, meaning that the followers of Jesus share in this threefold mission of the one after whom they are named. And this idea was also picked up by St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century, and it was worked out in detail by John Calvin in the 16th century. Both hold, just like many other theologians, that Christians have a priestly, am I understandable, or yeah, okay, have a priestly, a kingly, and a prophetic calling. And now let's try to apply this idea to dealing with food in the Anthropocene. What would that mean? First, our priestly calling suggests that we are priests of creation, and this theme has recently been highlighted a lot by Orthodox theologians. So here we learn as Protestants from Orthodox theology. I have a PhD student who just graduated on biodiversity loss, reflecting on that theologically, and she made a big deal of this notion of human beings as being priests of creation, which she borrowed from Eastern Orthodox thinkers as Alexander Schmemann and also Elizabeth Jokritrop, the female theologian. And I think rightly so. This is something we Protestants should be reminded of. Our religion is much in our head, right? In the right doctrine, the right propositions. But this Eastern notion of creation theology, humans as priests of creation, is much more to the heart, speaking to the heart in some way. So this comes with a sense of intimate connectedness of humans with the non-human part of creation and with a spirituality in which we experience that we are inextricably bound up with creation rather than standing on top of it. And as we are priests, organic matter like bread and wine forms the sacramental material that is thankfully received, but also offered back to God in thanksgiving. Each time we pray for a blessing for our food, we realize that this food is not pure matter, but belongs to God, who's to be praised for it. So that's the priestly task. It relates to our spirituality. Second, dealing with nature in appropriate ways is not just a matter of spirituality, but also of practice. So we not only have a priestly, but also a kingly task to fulfill. In Western traditions, in particular, this kingly task has been conceived of in terms of humans being vice-regent, vice-kings, or stewards of creation. Chris already pointed to this notion of stewardship in Western in Protestant theology. Like a king has dominion over a certain territory, humans have been entrusted dominion over every living thing, as Genesis 1:28 has it. In recent scholarship, the notion of humans as stewards has come under quite severe criticism for several reasons. And indeed, isolated from the priestly and prophetic roles humans also have, this metaphor is ambiguous and open to abuse and misunderstanding. I mean, it's a managerial picture. It puts humans on top of the rest of creation, etc. And still, I think perhaps we cannot do totally without it, because we are responsible for the non-human part of the earth. We have a task to cultivate things and perhaps even to combat climate change by using technology. I'm not against that. It's not to be to trust technology, it's not to worship it, it's not to expect our salvation, but perhaps we should be wise towards by making use of it. And third, apart from spirituality and practice, there's also the capacity, we also have the capacity to speak. So there is something relevant to our heart, priests of creation, the spirituality is something to do with our hands, but there's also something to do with our mouth in a sense. It's the prophetic ministry of Christ, which relates to the way in which Jesus spoke truth to power, as they say, for Pontius Pilate, for example, but also, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount. Similarly, the prophetic role that Christians today have includes unmasking the often hidden powers that perpetuate unjust patterns of food production and distribution, such as big agrotech companies that only seem to care for their own profits at the expense of the land, animals, nature, and farmers alike. And also, our prophetic task requires that we don't look away from the troubling consequences of our own patterns of meat consumption, for example, and fossil fuel-driven forms of travel and production. For biblical prophets don't just point to others, but first of all, are themselves the first hearers and doers of the word of God, right? And then finally, it's important to see that the theological tradition does not speak of three offices of Christ, as if they are all separate from each other, but it's about one threefold office. So that means that these three are perichoretically connected to each other, like the persons of the Trinity in a sense. So they should not be played off against each other, since they permeate, reinforce, and mutually influence each other. So I know many people are concentrating on spirituality and prayer, perhaps at the expense of action and protest. Others, many young people in my own country, are very much involved in protest against climate destruction, but they're almost desperate. So they don't have any hope because they realize how disastrous the situation is. And they are desperate because they lack the spirituality, right? They don't have this trusting relationship with God that at the end of the day the earth is God's creation. And if you lose that, if you lose spirituality, you end up perhaps in desperation. So that's why I think the three are combined. We need each of them as a unity. Some of us may concentrate more on spirituality, others on practice, and still others on protest. But we definitely need all three of them. And then, to be sure, the various offices of Christ, this is my final sentence, by the way, they don't tell us directly what to do in the case of concrete dilemmas. They may not offer us a strict guideline as to whether or not we should become vegans or vegetarians, perhaps, or flexitarians. But internalizing the notion of Christ's threefold office will nurture the ethos. I think it was one of the former speakers who used this notion of ethos, which is important here. So this will nurture the ethos that we need to act with spiritual discernment in all sorts of food-related situations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Van den Brink, for giving us a more systematic approach when it comes to food from his own tradition, which is very useful in order to be able to bring together everything and understand how Christians in all churches may tackle the challenges of climate crisis. I do hope that this conference allowed you to add a chapter to your new book, which seems very important. But we have time for some questions.
I'm just curious about one of the final points you made about the prophetic witness in the public square. Can you give us some examples from your tradition in terms of how you yourself, your colleagues, how they're entering the spaces where activists are engaging?
Yes, sure. So we have quite a couple of groups of Christians which try to mobilize fellow Christians in this type of climate action. For example, Christians for Climate we have, and they participate in protest demonstrations. I myself have been part of one which was located in the region where my university is based, and this is a business location with all these huge flats where big companies reside. So close to the airport, Schiphol. There's also my university, and we intentionally organized a protest march, a protest demonstration, walking with a big group of people around in this territory. We try to find places not only to tell others, we not only tell others how it should be done, but also ourselves try to green. So we also have Green Churches Initiative, which means that churches should themselves, Protestant churches should themselves work on becoming more sustainable in the way they use energy, etc. So there's a lot going on, also in my own country. Yeah.
Chris Brander.
Thank you very much for this. I like the discussion of the threefold priest, king, prophetic as well. And, would you draw a distinction between, monarchy and tyranny then, right? It seems to me that you are. And I was wondering if you could elaborate upon that, right? A lot of people today, especially social justice activists and eco-justice activists, are critical of monarchy. But maybe there's democracy has ushered in tyrants, as it has in my country. So, maybe, you could elaborate a little bit on the difference between, eco-tyranny and eco-monarchy in a good sense.
Yeah. So I think eco-monarchy can indeed easily move into the direction of tyranny. And that's why we also need both other offices, exactly because they counterbalance each other. So the priestly role keeps us tightened to the spirituality from which this all stems, and may prevent us from going into a direction of managerial thinking all the way down. I also like in this connection the distinction you made yourself between stewardship as dominion on the one hand and stewardship as taking responsible care of creation on the other hand. I would definitely go for the second definition of what stewardship implies. I've been wrestling with this for a while because I can see the dangers which are implicit in this notion of humans as vice regents of creation. And still, I think the human species has a unique task here. So we cannot leave creation care to chimpanzees, right? So we have to take care of this ourselves, and we have to do this in ways which really make a difference, I would say. So that's our kingly task in a sense. Yeah.
Professor.
Oh yeah, it was you who came up with this notion of ethos. Now I remember. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Evharisto, thank you very much for your presentation. And I can speak in English or I can speak in Greek, whatever you want.
For me, English is slightly easier. English. Yeah.
English, okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I liked it very much. I also like all these ideas about being a priest or a king or a prophet. My only problem is, do you think that women would somehow identify themselves with these male metaphors? Because we have to address all kinds of members of the congregation. How could, as an Orthodox, perhaps for you in your tradition is different, but being an Orthodox notion of being a priest of creation, is that too male? From your point of view, what do you think? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, of course. Thank you for that one. So in my own tradition, so in my own church, the ministry is open to women as well as to men. So we do have female. We don't call them priests, but we typically call them ministers or pastors. Ever since I think the 1917 or something, or even earlier perhaps. Yeah, 1916 I believe. So it's not a big issue in my own church, although parts of the church still don't have them. So in parts of the church it's still an issue. I do realize that this notion of priests of creation was also put to the fore by Elizabeth Theokritov, which is a female Orthodox theologian. So apparently she doesn't see much of a problem here as a female theologian. So I would think it can work both ways. So if you start speaking of humans of all genders, female, male, as priests, kings, and prophets, that means that these offices are also open to all three of them. So if we start to do that, why would it be restricted to male persons? We used to have a female king, a queen in the Netherlands. We now have a king. So the kingly office apparently is no longer male only. And the prophetic role, even the Bible knows female prophets. So there's some leeway here, I would think. Do you feel uncomfortable? Yeah, with this? Okay.
Υπάρχει κάποια άλλη ερώτηση?
A question? Before giving the floor to Stephen, I would like to add that one of the first Orthodox theologians that talk about priest of creation was Ioannis Zizoulas.
Edited by me, John Christadis, has been published on the topic priest of creation, including text by Zizoulas.
Okay, wonderful.
By T.N.T. Clark. Anyway.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Just briefly, in answer to Professor Catherine's question, and to endorse what our friend, the speaker from the Netherlands, has said, I come from the UK, and in my understanding of British history, the greatest monarchs we've had in our history have been women, Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II. I don't really rate Victoria.
Mary Stuart.
Yes, okay. Elizabeth I is much misunderstood, but she was extremely clever and a great diplomat, working under very difficult circumstances, surrounded by very aggressive males. So yeah, that's just my point.
Thanks. Yeah.
Υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση, σχόλιο?
Is there any other question or comment?
Priests of creation. I do think it's a problem.
Mm.
And I have tried to work through reading Zuzulius's work, and I've read your edited piece, and it's been a grace to my work in many ways, but I do struggle with that idea. And I do think that perhaps it's unintentional, I don't know, but there is a kind of sexism that runs through that work. And actually, I was going to ask your help to kind of understand why I'm picking that up. And am I wrong? Because I'm not a theologian, I'm an anthropologist, so I struggle. But I do read it, and I did agree with our colleague over there who brought that point up. For us, because we don't ordain women, and because of our issues with the roles of women, highly contested, but not getting too much traction, it's kind of a rubric that I think is imposing, something for us to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, to give you a brief answer to this question, and I think that priest of creation is a kind of concept similar to that of personhood, for the Jews at least, which means it is more an anthropological type, but not a female or male distinction. It has to be, it is about the mode of existence, not about the gender or the race of a human being. So it's a more anthropological, inclusive concept than, let's say, a more natural understanding of what is human being, male or female.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly weigh in on this conversation. I see the problems in priests of creation, not only with the gendered aspect, but also with the role of the priest and in what needs to happen, right? So I spoke about natural, I'm working on a piece right now on this actually. There's natural diaconia that nature gives to us, the service nature gives to us, but mutual service is what Christians are called to. And drawing on Ignatius of Antioch, it is the deaconate that represents Christ on earth, not the bishops, not the priest, right? And why is that key? The piece I'm working on is to counter Zizioulas, but in the same sentiment and ethos, but the deaconate was and has never legally been foreclosed to women. And Orthodoxy does not have to reform itself in order to bring women into the deaconate. And in Orthodoxy, unlike Catholicism, the deacons or deaconesses are ordained. They are an ordained ministry. So this is an ordination. And I think I do advocate for females being ordained as deacons, bringing them into the clerical role. And I think deacons of creation is actually more appropriate for our life in this anthropocentric and ecologically destructive time. So yeah, I'd like to share that with all of you when I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you for that reflection. So it reminds me that in my own Reformed traditions, we do have 3 offices actually for people. So one is the minister or the priest, the other one is the deacon, and the third one is the elder. And then we typically relate the priest to the priestly, the minister to the priestly role of Christ, the elder to the kingly role, and the deacon to the the deacon to the priestly role, and the minister to the prophetic role. The minister is the one who speaks the word, right? So, and the priest is the one who serves, like the deacon does. So we don't see a lot of discrepancy between priest and deacon here. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Van den Brik.
Thank you.